The starboard engine of the Xylos's Hope had been silent for 11 cycles. Myra, elder of what remained of the Xylarian people, pressed her palm against the cold viewport and watched the dying light of the Proxima system fade behind them. 47,000 souls crammed into 16 ships, fishing vessels retrofitted for cryo, cargo haulers turned arcs, one half-functional science vessel that had been their flagship because it still had working life support. They had left behind a burning homeworld, 1,000 years of history turned to glass, and 2 civilizations that had closed their doors the moment they saw the Volak war fleet on their scanners. Elder, her tactical officer Kaelin, approached with the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept in a week. "We've entered the Sol system. Sensor sweeps confirm 8 planets, one with significant oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, third from the star. Humans call it Earth." Myra closed her eyes, in their response to our broadcast. Kaelin's mandibles twitched, the Xylarian equivalent of a swallowed sob. "They've responded. A single transmission, no conditions, no demands, just coordinates for atmospheric entry and a message, 'You're safe now. Welcome home.'" Silence filled the bridge. 47,000 refugees, hunted across 3 star systems by an empire that considered them less than vermin, and a species that had barely learned to walk among the stars, had just opened their front door without asking for a single thing in return. "That's impossible," whispered a young navigator. "No one does that, no one is that." Naive, Myra turned from the viewport, her aged eyes burning with something she thought the Volek had killed decades ago. "Hope, perhaps, or perhaps they are something we have never encountered before." The Xylos's Hope shuddered as Earth's gravity caught them. Below, through the burning haze of re-entry, Myra saw oceans and deserts and cities lit like scattered jewels against the dark. And then she saw the ships. Not warships, not weapons. Rescue vessels, hundreds of them. Some looked military, but most were clearly civilian, cargo transports, medical ships, even what appeared to be repurposed passenger liners. They were forming a corridor through the atmosphere, guiding the battered Xylarian fleet toward what the human transmission had called the Arizona Basin. "They're not afraid of us," Kaelin said, disbelief heavy in his voice. "They haven't seen the Volek yet," Myra replied. "They don't know what's coming." The landing was not graceful. The Xylos's Hope had been built for deep space, not atmosphere, and it hit the desert floor with a groan of tortured metal that made everyone on the bridge grab for support. Outside the viewport, dust clouds billowed like the ghosts of everything they'd lost. When the dust cleared, Myra saw them. Humans, hundreds of them, standing in the heat of a desert that would have killed a Xylarian in hours. They wore no environmental suits, their bodies somehow tolerated this brutal world, and they were not armed, not one weapon visible. Instead, they carried water, medical kits, blankets, children holding signs painted in crude Xylarian script, "Welcome FRINDS and you are not alone." Myra's legs gave out. She had prepared herself for suspicion, for quarantine, for guns pointed at her chest while politicians debated their fate. That was the civilized way, the way of the 2 species who had turned them away. That was the galaxy she knew. This was something else entirely. A human woman approached the disembarkation ramp. She was small by human standards, Myra would later learn, but she moved like someone who had never learned the word retreat. Her uniform bore insignia Myra couldn't read, and her face was streaked with something the Xylarians would come to recognize as sweat, the human body's absurd method of cooling itself. "My name is General Satomi Tanaka," the woman said, her words translated by the ship's failing universal translator. "On behalf of the United Nations of Earth, I welcome you to our world. We've prepared temporary shelter for 47,000. It's not much. We only had 48 hours notice, but it's safe. It's dry, and it's yours." Myra stumbled down the ramp, her 3 legs struggling on the unfamiliar metal. General Tanaka caught her. A human touching a Xylarian, something that would have required decontamination protocols and legal waivers everywhere else in the galaxy. "You're trembling," Tanaka said softly. "The Valek are coming," Myra whispered. 3 days behind us, maybe less. They will not stop. They have never stopped. We have brought a war to your doorstep, and we are so sorry." Tanaka's grip tightened. Her brown eyes, when they met Myra's, held no fear. "The Valak," she said, "are about to make the worst mistake in the history of this galaxy." Behind her, across the desert floor, Myra watched humans and Xylarians meeting for the first time. A human child offered water to a Xylarian child who had not drunk in 5 days. A human engineer opened a crate of tools and started asking Kalen about the Xylos' Hope's damaged engine. A human medic was already treating a young Xylarian soldier whose wounds had been sealed with nothing but emergency foam. In 16 years of running, Myra had forgotten what safety felt like. She was about to remember that safety, for humans, was not a passive thing. Hook, as Myra watched the humans work, a distant alarm echoed from the Xylos' Hope's bridge. Kalen's voice came through the ship's comm, stripped of all composure. "Elder, the Valak just entered the Sol system. They'll be in weapons range of Earth in 71 hours. General Tanaka smiled. It was not a kind smile. 71 hours, she said. Plenty of time to say hello. The Foundation. Marcus Cole had been an architect before the war that wasn't a war. The quiet, cold standoff that had defined human geopolitics for his entire childhood. He had designed libraries and museums, and one particularly ambitious underwater restaurant that had flooded twice before they got the seals right. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a military engineer. But when General Tanaka called at 2:00 a.m. with a voice that said not a request, he'd driven 9 hours through the night to reach the Arizona basin. And now he stood in the desert heat watching 47,000 exhausted aliens try not to die on his planet. "You have 48 hours to design a city," Tanaka had said. 72 to start building it, and somewhere in there figure out how to stop that. She'd pointed at the sensor data, 3,000 Valak warships, ETA 69 hours. Marcus had laughed. It was the kind of laugh that made people around him uncomfortable, the sound of a mind deciding that failure wasn't an option because the alternative was too horrific to consider. "Haven," he said now, tracing his finger across the holographic projection of the Arizona basin. "That's what we'll call it, not a refugee camp, a home." Standing beside him was a Xylarian engineer named Serev, a being with 4 arms, chitinous plating that shimmered like oil on water, and eyes that had seen her homeworld burn. She had spent the last 16 years patching together ships with salvage and desperation. She had never worked with someone who treated her like a colleague instead of a burden. "Humans," she said, her translator rendering her voice as a melodic contralto, "you do not have enough time to build a traditional settlement. The Valak will glass this desert before your foundations set." Marcus zoomed the projection. "That's why we're not building a traditional settlement. Look." The design unfolded. Not a city on the ground, a city in the ground. 3 levels descending, each one reinforced with a honeycomb of support pillars and redundant life support. The surface would look like a scattering of low domes, unremarkable from orbit. But underneath, a labyrinth of living quarters, medical bays, hydroponic gardens, and something else. Something that made Serev's mandibles go slack. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing at a network of tunnels branching off from the lowest level. "Subway system," Marcus said. 60 miles of rail connecting Haven to 7 other emergency bunkers across the southwest. If one location falls, the population distributes. The Valak can't kill what they can't find in one shot. Serev stared at him. "You planned this. In one night, you had a contingency for alien refugees you didn't know existed 48 hours ago." Marcus rubbed his eyes. He hadn't slept, and it showed. Humans have been preparing for the end of the world since we figured out the world could end. We've got bunkers all over the planet. Nuclear war, asteroid impact, solar flares. We've planned for everything except maybe zombies. And there are probably some guys in a basement somewhere working on that too. That was the moment Sarev realized two things simultaneously. First, that humans were possibly insane. Second, that their insanity might save her people. The construction began at dawn. Marcus had expected chaos. He got a symphony. Human construction crews worked alongside Xylarian laborers, the two species learning each other's rhythms through gestures and grunts, and the universal language of exhausted mutual respect. A human welder named Darnell Washington taught a Xylarian teenager how to fuse support beams, while the teenager taught Darnell the Xylarian word for brother. A Xylarian structural engineer spent an hour arguing with a human foreman about load tolerances before they realized they were both right and merged their designs into something stronger than either had imagined. Hour 30, Level 1 complete. The first Xylarian civilians moved underground, children first, then the elderly, then everyone else. Myra stood at the entrance to Haven, watching her people disappear into the earth, and she wept openly. She had forgotten that dry land could feel like safety. Hour 48, Level 2 complete. Marcus hadn't slept. Neither had Sarev. They stood together on the surface, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and red, and Sarev asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "The tunnels," she said. "The lower level, you didn't show me everything." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled up a schematic that wasn't part of the official plans. Sarev leaned in, and her breath stopped. "This is not a bunker," she said. "No," Marcus agreed, "it's not." The schematic showed something impossible. Something that shouldn't have been possible for a species that had only been interstellar for 100 years. It showed weapons, not bolted onto the city as an afterthought, but woven into its very structure. The support pillars were designed to collapse in specific patterns, creating kill boxes. The ventilation systems could flood tunnels with non-lethal gas or seal off sections like arterial clamps. And the lowest level, the one Sarev had assumed, was a subway, connected not just to other bunkers, but to a network of surface-to-orbit missile silos that hadn't existed on any map 24 hours ago. "When did you build these?" Sarev whispered. "We didn't," Marcus said. "They've been here for 30 years, Cold War leftovers. Our species pointed them at each other for so long that when the Cold War ended, we forgot to take them down. We just maintained them, in case." Sarev's translator struggled with the next sound she made, a Xylarian expression that roughly translated to "Holy Ancestors protect us." "The Volok have never faced a species that spent its entire history preparing to kill itself," she said slowly. "They will not understand what they are seeing." Marcus looked up at the stars, where 3,000 warships were accelerating toward Earth at impossible speed. "Good," he said. "Let them be confused." Hook, a young Xylarian child, tugged on Sarev's arm and pointed at the sky. A streak of light was burning across the darkness, not a shooting star but something smaller, faster. "That's not a ship," Sarev said. Then her blood went cold. "That's a scout probe. They're already here, and they've seen everything." The fortress rises. Corporal Elena Vasquez had flown simulations of this moment 1,000 times. In the Sims, she always had more fuel, more missiles, and wingmates who survived past the first engagement. In The Sims, she had never watched a civilian transport explode on her HUD because she was 3 seconds too slow. The Volek scout probe hadn't been armed. It hadn't needed to be. It had simply drifted through Earth's outer sensor net, recorded 2 hours of footage, and transmitted it back to the fleet before anyone realized what it was. Now the Volek knew about Haven. They knew about the bunkers. They knew about the missile silos that were supposed to be a secret. And they were accelerating. Elena's squadron, the 94th Intercept, Coulson Reapers, had been scrambled at 3:00 a.m. to intercept a secondary probe that was trying to slip through the orbital debris field. They'd caught it 40,000 kilometers above the Pacific, and Alina had personally painted it with her targeting computer, her finger hovering over the trigger. "Reaper lead to all units," she said into her comm. "We have weapons free. Repeat, weapons free. Take the shot." She fired. The probe detonated into a cloud of glittering fragments that caught the rising sun and scattered light across the black like a funeral pyre. "Scratch one," said her wingmate, Lieutenant Jamal Carter. Then softer, "That makes 3 this hour. How many more are out there?" Alina didn't answer. She was watching her long-range sensors where 3,000 Volek warships had just lit their main drives. New ETA, 48 hours. They were burning hard, faster than their engines were rated for. They wanted Earth, and they wanted it now. "Reaper flight returned to base," came the voice of Air Command. "All units fall back to orbital defense perimeter. Repeat, fall back to the perimeter." "The perimeter isn't finished," Alina said. "It's finished enough." It wasn't. Alina knew it wasn't. The orbital railgun network was at 60% capacity. The weave, that insane, brilliant, impossible electromagnetic shield that Marcus Cole had designed, had been tested exactly once, and the test had overloaded 3 power grids and knocked out comms across 4 states. The fortress they were trying to build wasn't ready. But the Volek weren't going to wait. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of welding and wiring and desperate, screaming work. Every human on the planet who could hold a tool was helping, not just military engineers, but construction workers, farmers, students, retirees. A grandmother in Florida knitted blankets for Zalarian children, while her grandson live-streamed tutorials on how to jury-rig emergency air filters. A crew of electricians from Chicago flew to Arizona on their own dime and worked 48 hours straight to get Haven's backup generators online. And above it all, in the cold silence of orbit, the fortress grew. Alina watched from the cockpit of her fighter as humans and Xylarians worked side by side on the orbital platforms, tethered to the hulls, moving in the careful dance of people who knew that one mistake meant dying in vacuum. She saw a Xylarian engineer named Vex sacrifice his EVA suit's oxygen supply to finish a critical weld, nearly suffocating before a human astronaut dragged him to an airlock. She saw a human technician named Mei Lin recalibrate a railgun turret, while a Volek scout drone homed in on her position, ignoring the alarms screaming in her helmet. "We're not going to be ready," Jamal said over the private channel. "We're going to be what we are," Alina replied. "That's all we've ever been." At T-12 hours, Marcus Cole appeared on every screen on Earth. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 4 days, gray streaks in his hair, dark circles under his eyes, his left arm in a sling from an accident that no one had time to treat properly. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "People of Earth, people of Xylar, the Volek will be in orbit in 12 hours. They have 3,000 ships. They have never lost a war. They have exterminated 17 species." He paused. "We have each other. We have a planet that has spent 4 billion years trying to kill us, and we survived it. We have weapons designed by a species that never learned to stop fighting because we never learned to stop hopping. And we have the truth, the one truth the Volek have never faced. We are not running from anything. This is our home, and we will not give it up." The broadcast cut to a live feed of Earth from orbit. The planet looked the same as it always had, blue and green and white, fragile and beautiful. Then the orbital platforms activated. The weave spread across the atmosphere like a second skin, a shimmering web of electromagnetic energy that turned the sky into a barrier. No ship could cross without permission. The railgun networks swiveled into position, their barrels aimed at the approaching fleet. And below, on the surface, every missile silo on the planet opened its doors. 3,000 ships against one planet. The Volek had better numbers. But the fortress was rising. Alina's comm crackled. Reaper lead, this is Air Command. The Volek fleet just entered weapons range. They're hailing us. What do they want? A pause, then with a note of disbelief. They want our surrender. Alina keyed her microphone. Tell them no. Hook, the Volek flagship, a massive dreadnought that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built, positioned itself directly over the Arizona basin. Its shadow stretched across the desert, across Haven's unfinished domes, across the Zalarian children who had finally stopped running. Admiral Thrax of the Volek Empire opened a channel to Earth. Primitives, he said, you have 1 hour to deliver the refugees to our guns. After that, we will burn your cities until your oceans boil. Alina Vasquez looked at the clock. 59 minutes. She smiled. We only need 30. The first blood. The Volek ships descended through the upper atmosphere like blades falling. Admiral Thrax had commanded 63 extermination campaigns. He had watched species beg, bargain, and betray each other for the privilege of a quick death. He had seen planetary defenses before, the desperate last stands of civilizations that knew they were already dead. None of them had prepared him for what happened next. Admiral, his censor officer said, confusion bleeding into his voice. The primitives are firing. Thrax turned to the main view screen. Of course they're firing. Every species fires. It's what they. The Sword of Volek, his flagship's forward escort, evaporated. Not exploded. Not crippled. Evaporated. A railgun round moving at 4% of lightspeed had punched through its main reactor, and now there was nothing left but a cloud of expanding plasma and a scream of dying comms. Return fire, Thrax roared. The Volek fleet answered. Thousands of energy beams lanced downward toward the surface, toward the cities and the bunkers and the orbital platforms that had somehow just killed one of their ships. The beams stopped, not impacted, not absorbed, stopped. 10 kilometers above the surface, the Volek weapons fire hit the weave and simply dissipated like rain hitting a hot stove. What is that? Thrax demanded. His science officer was already pale. An electromagnetic barrier, Admiral. It's turning our energy weapons into heat. The atmosphere is bleeding off the energy before it reaches the surface. We can't hit anything on the ground. Below, Alina Vasquez watched the Volek fleet hesitate. It was only a moment, a heartbeat of confusion, but it was enough. Reaper flight, she said. All units engage. The 94th Intercept dropped from the orbital platforms like stones, their engines silent, their weapons hot. They had been hiding in the weave's shadow, invisible to Volek sensors, and now they fell upon the enemy fleet like wolves on a wounded herd. Alina's targeting computer screamed as she locked onto a Volek cruiser. She fired. Her missiles crossed the distance in seconds, slamming into the ship's engines and sending it spiraling into the atmosphere. It didn't explode. The weave shredded it first, tearing it apart molecule by molecule until nothing remained but a streak of fire across the sky. One down, she said, hundreds to go. But the Volek recovered faster than she'd hoped. Their ships scattered, breaking formation, denying the railguns the concentrated targets they needed. Energy weapons were useless, but kinetic weapons, railguns of their own, missiles, even debris, could still get through. The Volek started firing everything they had, not at the surface, but at the orbital platforms themselves. The fortress began to bleed. Alina watched in horror as Platform 7 took a direct hit, its reactor going critical, its crew, human and Zalarian both, consumed in a burst of light. Platform 3's railgun network went silent as a missile tore through its command center. Platform 9 was simply gone, vaporized by a Volek dreadnought that had pushed through the defensive line. Reaper lead to Air Command, Alina shouted. We're being overwhelmed. The platforms are falling. We need. Reaper lead, this is Haven Command. Marcus Cole's voice, strained but steady. Pull back to the second perimeter. We're activating the surface batteries. What second perimeter? What batteries? The answer came in the form of 1,000 streaks of light rising from the desert floor. The Cold War silos, the ones that had been pointed at each other for 30 years, opened their doors and unleashed hell. Conventional missiles, nuclear warheads, experimental weapons that had never been tested in atmosphere, all of it rose to meet the Volak fleet. The sky turned white. Thrax watched his sensor screens fill with incoming fire. 20 ships vanished in the first wave, 30 in the second. The primitives were throwing everything they had at him, and it was working, not because their weapons were superior, but because there were so many of them. They had been stockpiling these missiles for decades, waiting for an enemy that never came. Now that enemy was here, and the humans were spending their inheritance like water. "Admiral," his tactical officer said, "we can't maintain position. The surface fire is too dense. We need to pull back to orbit and reassess." Thrax stared at the view screen. Below, through the chaos of battle, he could see the planet, blue and green and white, so deceptively peaceful. He could see the fortress, wounded but still fighting. He could see the refugees, the Zalarian vermin he had hunted across the galaxy, still breathing. "No," he said, "deploy the world killer." Silence filled the bridge. "Admiral," his science officer whispered, "the resonance cannon hasn't been tested on a planet with a magnetosphere this strong. The backlash could." "I said deploy it." On the surface, Myra watched the Volek fleet part and something massive descended from the flagship's belly. It was a weapon. She knew it the way prey knows a predator's teeth. Her people had stories of this thing. The world killer, the final solution. She grabbed the nearest human soldier, a young man named Private Derek Chen, who had been assigned to protect the Zalarian Council. "That weapon," she said, pointing at the sky, "it will shatter the crust, it will kill everything, you have to stop it." Derek Chen looked up at the descending horror. He was 19 years old. He had joined the army because his father had served and his grandfather had served, and he didn't know what else to do with his life. He had never killed anyone before today. He picked up his radio. "All units, this is Haven Actual. Priority target in the atmosphere. We need every weapon we have on that thing. Every single weapon." The response came from a dozen different voices, human and Zalarian, military and civilian. "Copy, engaging." "Copy, weapons free." "Copy, tell my wife I love her." Elena Vasquez heard the call. Her ship was damaged, her wingmates were dead or scattered, and she had 3 missiles left. "Reaper lead to any unit," she said. "I'm going in." Hook, the world killer's charging sequence began, a low hum that vibrated through the atmosphere, through the ground, through the bones of every living thing on Earth. Elena pushed her damaged fighter toward the weapon, knowing she wouldn't survive the run. Then something unexpected happened. Every Volek ship on the scope suddenly went dark, not destroyed, hailing. A new voice came through the comm. "This is the colony ship Hope's last chance. To the Volek fleet, turn around. We have your children." The breaking point. The voice on the comm belonged to a Zalarian. Specifically, it belonged to Kalen, Myra's tactical officer, the hollow-eyed man who had announced the Volak's arrival 6 days ago. He was supposed to be in Haven, coordinating civilian evacuation. Instead, he was transmitting from a hijacked Volek supply ship that had been hiding in the asteroid belt for the past 72 hours. "We have your children," Kalen repeated, and this time he wasn't speaking to the humans. "Admiral Thrax of the Volek Empire, hear me. 3 years ago, after you glassed our colony on Xylos Roman II, we captured a Volek nursery vessel. 5,000 Volek young, untouched by your empire's wars, raised by Zalarian caretakers who taught them that killing is not the only way. They are on this ship, and if you fire that weapon, they die with us." On the bridge of the Sword of Volek, Admiral Thrax stared at his view screen. The hidden ship had just decloaked, a small, battered vessel that had been drifting among the asteroids for 3 years, waiting for a moment like this. His sensors confirmed the life signs. 5,000. All Volek. All juvenile. "You're bluffing," he said. Kalen's face appeared on the screen. He looked different than he had in Haven, no longer hollow-eyed and exhausted, but calm, resolved, the face of someone who had already made peace with death. "I spent 16 years running from you," Kalen said. "I watched my children die in your camps. I watched my mate burn on our homeworld. I have nothing left to lose. Do you?" The World Killer's charging sequence paused. Thrax's tactical officer spoke quietly. "Admiral, if those are our young, the political ramifications of their deaths." "I know the ramifications." Thrax snapped. Below on Earth the battle had stalled. Both sides were watching the standoff unfolding in high atmosphere. A single hijacked ship, 5,000 Volek children, and a weapon that could end a planet. Elena Vasquez floated in the cockpit of her crippled fighter, drifting through the debris field of what used to be Platform 7. Her oxygen was at 12%. Her comm was barely functional, and she was listening to a Xylarian threaten to kill children. She had joined the Air Force to protect people, not to watch this. "Kalen," she said, her voice crackling over the open channel. "Kalen, don't." Kalen's face turned toward her camera. "Corporal Vasquez, you don't understand. The Volek will never stop. They will hunt us across every star in the galaxy. The only way to end this is to make them understand that the cost of continuing is too high. And killing children is the way to do that. The Volek killed our children, thousands of them, millions. Where was your mercy then?" Elena had no answer. She had no training for this. No simulation had ever included a moment like this, a hostage crisis where the hostage taker was the victim and the victims were the enemy. But she had something else. She had Marcus Cole's voice in her ear, speaking to her on a private channel. "Elena," he said, "the World Killer is still charging. Thrax hasn't stopped it, he's just hesitating. He's going to fire anyway. He's going to call Kalen's bluff." "How do you know?" "Because he's a military commander, and military commanders don't negotiate with terrorists, not when they have a bigger gun." Elena looked at her remaining missiles. 3. Not enough to stop the World Killer, not enough to do anything but scratch its armor. Then she looked at the hijacked supply ship. 5,000 Volek children, and Kalen, a man who had lost everything, holding a gun to the head of his enemy's future. "Marcus," she said, "what would you do?" Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, sadder. "I'd remember that we're supposed to be better than them." The World Killer's charging sequence resumed. Thrax had made his decision. His ships were already moving to intercept the hijacked supply ship, weapons hot. Kalen's face on the screen showed no fear, only disappointment, as if he had expected nothing less. "Kalen, this is Elena Vasquez," she said. "Don't do it, I'm coming to you. Your fighter can't reach us. You're out of fuel, out of weapons, out of time. Then I'll drift, but I'm not going to let you become them." Below in Haven, something else was happening. Myra had gathered the Xylarian children, the ones who had survived, the ones who still believed in tomorrow, and she was leading them in a song. It was an old song, a lullaby from their homeworld, a song about the stars being made of light and the darkness being only temporary. The human soldiers guarding the bunker listened, and then, one by one, they started to sing too. They didn't know the words, they didn't know the tune, but they hummed, they swayed. They reached out and held the hands of Xylarian children who had never known a gentle touch. The sound drifted upward through Haven's ventilation shafts, through the wreckage of the surface, through the smoke and the fire and the screaming of dying ships. Kalen heard it. He had spent 3 years raising those Volek children, feeding them, teaching them, watching them grow. He had told himself it was a strategy, a weapon, a way to hurt the empire that had taken everything from him. But when he heard the humans singing with Xylarian children, he remembered what children were supposed to be. Not weapons, not hostages, just children. Thrax, he said, opening a channel to the Volek flagship. I'm not going to kill them, I never was, but here's what I am going to do. I'm going to broadcast every transmission from this battle to every corner of the galaxy. Every comm channel, every frequency. The galaxy will see what you did here today. They will see you fire on a species that welcomed refugees, that built homes for the homeless, that sang lullabies for children who weren't their own, and they will remember. Thrax's face was carved from stone. You think the galaxy cares about morality? I think, Kalen said, that the humans are about to teach you something about morality. The World Killer fired. Hook, the beam struck the weave, and for a moment the sky held. The electromagnetic barrier flexed, buckled, screamed in frequencies no human ear could hear. And then, with a sound like the universe tearing apart, the weave shattered. The beam continued downward, toward Haven, toward the children, toward everything. The turning. The World Killer's beam never reached the ground. 3 kilometers above the Arizona desert, something intercepted it. Something that hadn't existed 20 minutes ago. A secondary barrier, woven from the debris of the destroyed orbital platforms, powered by every backup generator on the continent, and held together by sheer, stubborn refusal to let the children die. Marcus Cole stood in Haven's Central Command, one hand pressed against a console that was glowing red-hot, the other missing entirely, lost 30 seconds ago when a power conduit had exploded and he'd shoved a Xylarian engineer out of the way. His vision was tunneling. His ears were ringing, but he could see the readout. The weave was gone, but the shadow weave, the emergency backup he designed in case everything went wrong, was holding. Barely. Serev, he said, his voice a whisper, tell me you got the children out. Serev's face appeared on a cracked monitor. She was in the lower tunnels, guiding a stream of Xylarian and human civilians toward the secondary bunkers. 80% evacuated. The rest are in the safe rooms. Marcus, the barrier won't last another minute. The Volek are redirecting power to the cannon. They're going to fire again. Marcus looked at his console. The shadow weave was drawing power from everything. The grid, the generators, even the emergency batteries in the subway trains. There was nothing left. No reserves. No backup plan. Unless... Marcus, what are you doing? Serev's voice was sharp with fear. Something stupid, he said, and he started typing. Above, Elena Vasquez watched the World Killer's second charge cycle begin. Her fighter was dead in space, drifting through the wreckage of the orbital battle. She had 2 minutes of oxygen left. Her comm was picking up fragments of transmissions, humans praying, Xylarians weeping, children crying for parents who were already gone. And then she saw it. The Volek fleet was repositioning, not to fire on the surface, to fire on each other. What the hell? Jamal Carter's voice crackled over the comm. He was still alive. Somehow. Elena, are you seeing this? The Volek ships are turning on each other. She was seeing it. The cruiser that had been targeting Haven was suddenly burning, not from human fire, but from the dreadnought behind it. The dreadnought's weapons had swung around, punching through its own fleet's defenses. Ships were breaking formation, firing at random, their communications filled with screams of confusion and betrayal. Marcus, Elena breathed, what did you do? In Haven's command center, Marcus Cole was laughing. It was the same uncomfortable laugh from days ago, the laugh of a mind that had just broken reality and was enjoying it. The Volek fleet uses a networked command system, he said, his voice slurred from blood loss. Every ship reports to the flagship. The flagship gives orders, but if someone were to compromise that network, inject false data, make the flagship's sensor readings show that half the fleet had been infected by a Xylarian bioweapon. You hacked them, Serev said. You hacked the entire Volek fleet. I didn't hack them. I just showed them what they were most afraid of. The rest was their own paranoia. The Volek fleet was tearing itself apart. Ships that had fought together for decades were suddenly enemies, convinced that their comrades had been turned against them. The World Killer's charging sequence halted as its crew turned on each other, fighting shadows that existed only in their own minds. Admiral Thrax watched his empire crumble in real time. His flagship's bridge was chaos, officers screaming contradictory orders, weapons firing at friendly targets, sensor readings that made no sense and changed every second. "How?" he whispered. A human voice answered him, not Marcus Cole, not Elena Vasquez. A Xylarian child, one of the 5,000 on the hijacked supply ship, her face appearing on his view screen. "We raised your children," she said, her voice young and clear and terrifyingly calm. "We taught them that fear is not the same as strength. We taught them that an empire built on killing will eventually turn on itself. And we taught them how to access your comms network from the inside." Thrax stared at the child. She looked like his own daughter, the daughter he had lost to a political rival's assassination, the daughter whose death had made him embrace the cruelty of the Empire, because cruelty was the only thing that made sense in a universe that had taken everything from him. "Your people," he said slowly, "are more dangerous than I realized." "We're not dangerous," the child said. "We're just tired of running." Below on Earth, the shadow weave collapsed. But it didn't matter. The World Killer was offline, its crew too busy fighting each other to fire. The Volek fleet was in chaos, a third of its ships destroyed by friendly fire, another third fleeing in panic. Elena Vasquez's oxygen alarm was screaming. She had 30 seconds. No rescue was coming. No one even knew where she was. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother who had taught her to fly, her mother who had died in a training accident when Elena was 16, her mother who had told her on the last day they spoke, "The sky isn't the limit, baby. It's just the beginning." Something bumped against her cockpit. She opened her eyes. A Xylarian EVA suit was pressed against her canopy, one of the civilian models designed for construction work, not combat. Inside it, a young Xylarian soldier she didn't recognize was making hand signals. "Open the hatch. Hurry." She had no idea how he'd found her. No idea how he'd survived the battle. No idea if the EVA suit had enough oxygen for both of them. She opened the hatch. The Volek fleet was retreating. Not in good order, ships limping, burning, colliding with each other in their desperation to escape. The survivors would carry stories of this day. Stories of a species that turned its sky into a fortress. A species that hacked enemy fleets with nothing but courage and spite. A species that sang lullabies to alien children while the world burned around them. Admiral Thrax's flagship was one of the last to leave. As it limped toward the jump point, Thrax watched the blue-green planet shrink in his view screen. He had conquered 17 worlds. He had exterminated 4 species entirely. He had never seen anything like what he had just witnessed. "Note for the record," he said quietly to his remaining officers. "Earth is forbidden. Do not return. Do not communicate. Do not even think about this system again." "Why, Admiral?" Thrax watched the planet vanish into the darkness. "Because they didn't just defeat us. They made us defeat ourselves, and any species that can do that is not a species. It's a force of nature." Hook, the hijacked supply ship still carrying 5,000 Volek children, began its descent toward Earth. Kalen looked at the children, the ones he had raised, the ones he had almost sacrificed, and made a decision that would change everything. "Take us down," he told the pilot. "We're home. The home we built." 1 year later, the desert remembered. Not the battle. The ground had absorbed the blood and the fire and the ash, recycling it into something new, something that bloomed in the spring with flowers no one had ever seen before. No, the desert remembered the sound, the singing, the lullabies that had risen from Haven's vents, drifting across the sand like ghosts, like promises, like the universe's last, best argument against despair. Elena Vasquez stood at the edge of the Memorial Plaza, her prosthetic leg humming softly as it adjusted to the uneven ground. The leg was Zalarian-made, lightweight, responsive, far better than anything human medicine had produced. In return, she had taught her Zalarian co-pilots how to fly combat missions in atmosphere. The exchange was uneven in the best possible way. Both species had given each other gifts they hadn't known they needed. "Captain," a voice said behind her, "the ceremony is starting." She turned. Lieutenant Vex, the same young Zalarian soldier who had pulled her from her dying fighter, now her wingmate and her closest friend, stood at attention, his chitinous plating gleaming in the morning sun. He had taken a human name when he joined the 94th, not because he had to, because he wanted to. "Lieutenant," she said, "walk with me." The Memorial Plaza was built on the site where the weave had shattered. Marcus Cole had designed it as a spiral, descending into the earth, then rising again toward the sky, a reminder that destruction and creation were the same motion, just viewed from different angles. The walls were covered in names, humans and Zilarians who had died in the battle, 4,732. A fraction of what the Volak had taken from the Zilarians over the years. A tragedy still. At the center of the plaza stood Myra. She was older than she had been a year ago, the way survivors always aged, carrying the weight of what they'd seen and what they'd lost. But she was also standing straighter, breathing deeper, living for the first time in 16 years instead of just surviving. "People of Earth," she said, her voice amplified across the plaza, across the screens that carried the ceremony to every corner of the planet. "People of Xylar, we gather today to remember, to mourn, and to build." She gestured to the sky. Above them, the new orbital platforms gleamed, not just weapons now, but research stations, cultural centers, gardens. The fortress had become a home. The shield had become a bridge. "We came to Earth seeking safety," Myra continued. "We were refugees, beggars, a species that had been hunted to the edge of extinction. We expected suspicion. We expected cages. We expected, if we were very lucky, a cold indifference that would let us die in peace." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice cracked. "Instead, humans built us a home. They gave us their water, their food, their land. They gave us their dead, their children, their parents, their lovers, placed between us and the enemy. They turned their skis into a fortress, not to protect themselves, but to protect us." In the crowd, Marcus Cole shifted uncomfortably. His left arm was gone, replaced by a Xylarian-designed prosthetic that was still learning to obey his neural commands. He had not wanted to be here. He had wanted to be in his workshop, designing something new, something useful, something that would make up for the lives he couldn't save. But Serev had dragged him here. Serev, who had become his partner in more ways than one, her 4 arms wrapped around his human body, her chitin against his skin, 2 species learning that love didn't require the same biology, only the same heart. "You're thinking about the children," Serev whispered. Marcus nodded. The Volak children, 5,000 of them, now living in a dedicated wing of Haven, being raised by Zalarian caregivers and human volunteers, learning that their parents' empire was built on lies, learning that the galaxy was bigger than fear, learning that they had a choice. "I think about them every day," he said. "So do I," Serev replied. "That's how I know we did the right thing." At the podium, Myra was finishing her speech. Her voice had steadied, strengthened, become the voice of a woman who had stared into the abyss and watched the abyss blink. "We are not the same species," she said. "We will never be the same species. We breathe different air. We see different colors. We dream in different shapes. But we are family. And family does not abandon family. Family does not let family burn alone. Family builds fortresses in the sky and sings lullabies in the dark and fights and fights and fights until the enemy learns that some things cannot be killed." She raised her 3 arms to the sky. "This is our home now, not just Earth, not just Haven, but each other. And the skis that were once our prison, the void that hunted us, chased us, tried to swallow us, are now a promise. A promise that no matter how far we travel, no matter what darkness we face, there will always be a light waiting for us. The light of a species that saw strangers in the dark and said, "Welcome home." The plaza erupted, not in cheers and song. The same lullaby that had risen from Haven's vents during the battle. Humans and Xylarians singing together, their voices harmonizing in ways that shouldn't have been possible, creating something new and beautiful and entirely unexpected. Elena Vasquez looked up at the sky. The orbital fortress gleamed. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the clouds in shades of gold and red. Somewhere up there, teenagers, human and Xylarian both, were training to fly together, to fight together, to protect this world that had become theirs. "Vex," she said. "Yes, Captain. Tomorrow, we patrol the outer system. Make sure the Volek aren't thinking about coming back." "And if they are?" Elena smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a species that had learned to turn its sky into a fortress and was perfectly willing to do it again. "Then we remind them why Earth is haunted." Epilogue. In a small room at the edge of Haven, 5 Volak children sat in a circle with their Xylarian caregivers and human teachers. They were learning to read, not Volak propaganda, not military manuals, but stories, fairy tales, myths, the kind of stories that taught children that the world was worth saving. One of them, a young female named Zara, raised her hand. "Teacher," she said, "is it true, what the survivors say, that humans turned their sky into a fortress?" The teacher, a Xylarian named Alara who had once been a physicist and was now something far more important, nodded slowly. "It's true." Zara was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that would echo through history, passed from child to child, from generation to generation, until it became a legend. "Will they teach us how to do it too?" Alara smiled. It was the same smile that Myra had worn when she first stepped onto Earth's soil. The same smile that Marcus Cole had worn when he designed the impossible. The same smile that Elena Vasquez wore when she flew into battle. "They already are," she said. "They already are." And